It's been a couple of days since UFC boss Dana White revealed that the company had let go of heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou.
Maynard's phone to try to get a matchup with Ngannou. Down goes the Reem. Francis Ngannou has arrived.
They have their own story, while the media and the fans have theirs. But what does Ngannou have to say about all of this? Well, a lot. The heavyweight champ thinks his expulsion from the UFC was a result of White's desire to control his contract. Since they were unable to come to an agreement about it, and he wouldn't back down from his demands, White let him go.
As an independent contractor, you don't really have a say in that contract. You don't even have a right. So I can't do that.
This wasn't sudden, though. Their clash had been building up for the past 5 years. The first time Ngannou felt something negative between them was during his preparations to fight for the UFC belt against Stipe Miocic.
And leave these big openings.
Knocked down for Ngannou. Stipe back to his feet. Eats another uppercut. Nice counter right from Miocic. Who is knocked down and out. Francis Ngannou.
He had just negotiated his last contract at that moment. After that, it took the fighter around 3 years to figure out what the actual problem was, one that had been raised during that negotiation. Now that all is said and done, he admits that at that time, he didn't know what those words truly meant, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have the negative effect that they did. He'd proposed making a deal after each fight instead of discussing a proper contract once.
They should at least have a certain amount of sponsor that every fighter can put on his gear, because yet this is fighter's source of revenue.
In his defense, he felt pressured at the time with his fight looming over his head. He didn't have a manager to help him sort out issues like this. Looking back on that day, Ngannou realized how something like that shouldn't be said to someone like Dana White. But this doesn't mean that he agrees with whatever the executive has said about this fallout. In fact, he's got a lot to say against it. He broke his silence on the matter during an appearance on veteran MMA journalist Ariel Helwani's show, The MMA Hour.
He was before the Stipe fight. Because I negotiated the contract before my last contract was negotiated at that moment, and it took me almost 3 years to figure out what was the problem. But I think the problem was because during all this negotiation, I said something to Dana White, and this was by completely mistake.
This was his chance to clarify the claims that White had made in the media, which gave a one-sided view of the situation. Apparently, the fighter had been anticipating this kind of behavior from their end, which helped him deal with the entire situation easily.
Undisputed UFC heavyweight champion of the world, Francis.
He wasn't going to let their statements bother him because they were just a part of the plan. I've got to hand it to him. He's one mature guy for taking it this easy, but his relaxed attitude comes from a place of knowing his worth and how much he's given to the UFC and specifically White. The executive will have you believe that he's just stubborn and egotistical, but in reality, he's been willing to compromise way too many times. He had to take a step back and realize that he was the only one giving and receiving nothing in return. Yes, he was getting paid, and yes, they did say they'd make him the highest paid heavyweight in the company's history.
We offered Francis a deal that would have made him the highest paid heavyweight in the history of the company. More than Lesnar, more than anybody. And he turned the deal down.
But money isn't everything. Ngannou wasn't fighting just to have an insanely high salary. He had other demands that were never fulfilled or mentioned. Even in these interviews and conferences, they've only referenced what he would have made if he'd renewed the contract. But according to Ngannou, the negotiation wasn't even about the money. He even boiled it down to the exact moment where they actually decided that no agreement could be reached between them. It all came down to the fight with Jon Jones. Before it reached the public, they called him up to talk about the fight with Jon Jones, which was scheduled for March 4th. To make that fight happen, they had to come to an agreement and make a deal. That was the objective of their phone call. Of course, that objective wasn't reached. Ngannou didn't reveal what exactly it was, but he said that he wasn't on board with something and that it was non-negotiable for them. It was a matter of principle for the fighter, and he wasn't going to give in just for the sake of his pay or fame. When he hung up the phone, he knew that they'd reached the end of their partnership. Even though they hadn't discussed anything of the sort, he knew knew that it was going to happen. And well, his intuition was 100% accurate. A similar situation happened with his coach, Eric Nicksack, as he knew way before this phone call that his client's time with the UFC was drawing to a close. Before the fighter spilled the beans on the situation, his coach was interviewed by Helwani. It was then that he revealed the moment he'd understood that Ngannou's time in the UFC was nearing its end.
Man, we're just this close, tight family, and we take care of one another. We'll be together no matter what. So I'll be there for whatever capacity he needs me as.
It was the night after the fight with Gane.
10 seconds. And it looks as though Ngannou will end the fight in a relatively dominant position. Incredible.
They'd sat down to dinner with Hunter Campbell and Dana White and had a pretty good time. It had seemed like things were going in the right direction, but on the car ride back, Ngannou expressed his thoughts, which were the complete opposite. Agreeing to all the terms and conditions of the deal made him feel like a sellout. He would have been letting go of his demands and accepting a deal for money. This didn't line up for the fighter, as it questioned his principles, which just didn't sit well with him. According to Nicksack, he said that he refused to do any of that, which made it obvious that he would sooner rather than later break away from the UFC. After all, it was a matter of power and control. Even though he had disagreements and clashes with them, Ngannou was happy with his career.
He's fighting at range. Arlovsky fires, just misses. Ngannou comes over the top of the left, and boom, beautiful follow-up to his counter with that right hand.
The pay was pretty damn good, and he was in a great position as a fighter, but he didn't fully believe in the UFC. When he was promised the highest salary in UFC history, he wasn't instantly impressed. That's because he thought of it as an empty promise rather than a proper contract. From his point of view, he had to know what the other heavyweights had made if he were to find out what the highest pay ever would be. But even so, he just didn't want that contract. It didn't matter how much money he made off of it. He didn't want to sign something that was that binding. The fighter shared that he would have had no independence, rights, or freedom if he signed that contract. They would have been able to control him fully, and none of the power would have been in his hands. He wasn't a fan of how they used their power either, as he'd experienced it in the past and didn't want to have another. But you know what they say, every experience teaches you something, and Ngannou learned a couple of lessons too. One of the main things I learned was that you won't get everything you want out of a negotiation, but what you should look for is willingness on the other end.
Shot with the right hand. Does Blade's recovery still won't be on his feet? Mark Goddard's taking a closer look. Ngannou's powering in. Oh, this is bad news.
That's it. Francis Ngannou.
He admitted that he'd asked for a lot during his negotiations, but he never expected all of those things. It would have been fair for him to receive one or two, though. That much makes sense. But despite all of this bad blood, Ngannou claimed that he didn't take anything personally. He might even consider returning to fight for the company again someday.
Harris, as they bring in guys.
Oh, Ngannou knocks Arlovsky down. That is it. The Predator Francis Ngannou.
This is also inspired by a lesson he's learned, which is to never say never.
I can still be in the contract with the UFC and fight Tyson Fury and keep fighting in the UFC.
The return, however, would have to be on his own terms. That's about it for Ngannou's side of the story and this video. See you in the next one.